If I learned one thing being in AI for the last 3 years, more specifically the last 9 months building AI agents for regulated industries, such for example, finance and public infrastructure, is that large language models, especially agents as powerful as we see them today, are very, very expensive to run. That's why this particular update, more specifically by Anthropic just yesterday, is actually a little bit of a token of confidence for us AI builders that we can swap very advanced models to rather cheaper models and yield a similar degree of intelligence. So in today's video, I want to quickly just break down this suggested advisor strategy again by Anthropic, which ultimately basically is not something groundbreaking. It's just for us AI builders, once again, a degree and a confidence boost that we can basically be saying, right, let's not use Opus or the most advanced models for all the tasks. Rather, let's switch the curve and use a cheaper model like a Sonnet or a Haiku. And just for reference, if you, for example, go on artificial analysis, you probably most likely know this website. You can always select models and, for example, go for the Claude setup. And then you have an overview on all the prices, right? So you as an AI builder in the audience, you probably have some sort of a reference what the use case ultimately really is. And then back after this, you have to define which models should actually be yielding the particular use case. And you can see here on the screen, an Opus 4.6 and a Sonnet and a Haiku, they're differently priced based on input tokens and based on output tokens. So the more you give the model and the more it kind of, well, the price goes up. But then ultimately, the devil sits in the details of most of the time. The output tokens, they're completely differently priced. So if you go for a Haiku, that's 3 times cheaper than a Sonnet. And depending the way you actually run Opus, it is incredibly expensive on the multitude of output tokens. For example, if Opus generates a lot of code, for example, a Word document, a PowerPoint in Excel, or Python or any other coding language output, it becomes fairly costly. That's exactly why this advisor strategy, once again, gives us a little bit of a boost of confidence. And I have a bit of an AI builder P&L intuition just in the backlog for us to check out just in a second. But let's go quickly first through the blog post. What it essentially means is instead of always kind of placing Opus as an executor, which I believe many of us builders will actually be doing until this very day, because we believe that we need the most powerful model as base intelligence, or if it's not an Opus, maybe it's a similarly powerful model, even open source potentially, and then only the advisor or some sort of subtasks are actually being handed over or tool called to a cheaper model, like for example, as I mentioned before, potentially a Haiku or potentially a Sonnet. Now, in this particular blog post by Anthropic, proposed just a few hours ago, essentially, they're kind of, well, moving this whole stack around. So the executor becomes Sonnet or any cheaper model like a Haiku as well, which essentially is the main base intelligence. The way you would look at this from an AI builder perspective, you usually have some sort of a large language model that is your base intelligence, has a system prompt, and you kind of more or less engineer the harnesses around them. And in that particular case, once again, this is then swapped by a cheaper model, and then the advisor becomes Opus. The way this works essentially is kind of described here a little bit more in detail in the blog post. Basically, only when the executor, meaning the cheaper model, hits some sort of a bottleneck, a decision it can't reasonably solve, it consults the more expensive model, Opus, in that particular case for guidance, and it then acts as the advisor. Seems fairly obvious, but once again, most of the builders, I would say, intuitively first run to the very expensive large language model. And to also give credit to us builders, it was also Anthropic that said it makes sense to usually run the most expensive model. It might still eventually be the cheapest way to run any multi-agent system because it has less iterations and corrections, but they probably reverted with this particular idea a little bit from that. Ultimately, what it really means, it saves cost. This whole exercise is really to save cost. You have some sort of again, similar output in terms of intelligence at cheaper cost. If you're not fully only running, again, Opus at very much more expensive prices, yet you're mostly running a Sonnet or a Haiku, and then you're more or less yielding a similar degree of intelligence. That's ultimately what you would want. And of course, they more or less continue explaining how you would be integrating this into the cloud platform. But what I quickly want to break down just in the second stage of today's video is why is this truly meaningful for us AI business builders? Ultimately, our true goal is, of course, to increase our margin to then ultimately print money or generate income from our software as a services, agentic systems, or anything in between. Because potentially maybe you're building custom AI agents for your clients, or you have an agentic SaaS for any niche industry, like, for example, sales or marketing or finance or law, or a combination of these. And ultimately, you have kind of three levers to pull, right? So you have the infrastructure cost. Just for the sake of simplicity, I assume in this particular P&L intuition that they're more or less fixed. Of course, they scale up, but more in steps. So if you jump from 10 to 50 to 100 customers, of course, infrastructure goes up, but it's not a linear increase usually. Then the red component here on the P&L is essentially the buffer that's really hindering you from making a lot of money. So the 15, let's say $1,000 is really at the end of the day kind of your profit essentially. Let's call it like that. And the 55 is really the cost you have for inference in that particular example. Now, when we're moving more into, for example, this particular lever, like I was just explaining before, the advisor strategy as an example, or we're also, for example, optimizing on caching. There is a huge actually improvement that we can do on prompt caching. Maybe I do a future video on that as well. So that's a simple technique you can simply do. But ultimately what it really does, right? So the current setup might be incredibly just Opus heavy and you have a lot less, I would say, degrees of optimization. So your inference cost is still the large chunk of this. And maybe you go more and more and more into some optimization steps. And ultimately your inference cost is a lot more reduced. Then again, your infrastructure costs remain the same. In this particular chart, I assume a so-called outcome-based pricing strategy where you and your clients, you're actually predefining for a particular work done by your agent, more or less like sometimes it is happening for us humans as well. There's a pre-agreed price. As an example, your agent generates a compliance matrix in an Excel, or your agent actually handles an outreach, or your agent handles an inbound call from one particular client that's successfully handled. That has a particular price tag, and this price tag is always unchanged. So you as an AI business builder, the leverage you would want to build is essentially, well, get to this particular outcome as cheap as possible, while of course having all the infrastructure costs in play. Again, the leverage you have is AI inference costs that you can reduce. The cheaper you can run this particular outcome, the more margin you have and the more eventually your AI business is generating income. That's a little bit the high level intuition. Once again, you're moving from an AI inference unoptimized system to a more optimized system, to then really a fully optimized system with advisor patterns like we've seen today. You can fully engineer it in your own AI business as well with caching, or use just generally speaking, cheaper models in a different array. So that's a little bit the update. I thought it's incredibly interesting once again, and we've seen the push by Anthropic itself. Please do not use our most expensive model, rather generate an advisor strategy in the sense that use our cheaper models, and only Opus, a very, very advanced model, is actually doing just the tiny lifting and not the heavy lifting once again. Yeah, so that was it for the video. Again, the absolute outcome on this is the intelligence is more or less on par, and there is cheaper cost for your AI business, and ultimately, well, you'll be generating more money. So that was it for the video, and see you in the next one. Take care.